in progress.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second to last legislative update for the 2026 legislative session. Next slide, please. Just some quick logistics before we run through the presentation. As you may recall, we are using a new format this session. We can take questions via the Q&A feature at any time, so feel free to pop those in as we go through. And if we have time at the very end, we'll take live questions from the audience. So just as a reminder, questions through the QA feature, and then live questions at the very end of our presentation today. Next slide. All right, as you can see, we are nearing the end of the legislative session. We expect the legislature to adjourn Sine Die, which is Latin for without a day. That signifies the end of the 2026 legislative session. We expect it really anytime within the next few hours. The House has a handful of bills left. The Senate has just a couple as well, and we'll need some rule suspension to get all of the bills through. This update today will focus on what's happened since we last talked about legislative session. We'll go over key bills, the LOC priority bills, as well as the budget that was released over last weekend. We have one more session planned for you next Friday at noon, where we'll summarize what passed during the legislative session. So some of that has been coming up along the way. We'll spend more time next week diving deeper into each individual program area, or excuse me, each individual policy area, and discussing the summary of what happened. That will be a bit of a teaser for our legislative report expected to be released in March. Next slide. All right, the big context for this legislative session was the budget deficit that was faced by the Oregon state or Oregon government. That deficit has been a bit confusing to track. If you're having a hard time following along, you are not the only one. But before we dive into what happened with the budget, I want to just take that step back and provide some context. We started the legislative session with around $750 million deficit identified by HR 1. That is because both of the changes in requirements for state programs, or rather federal programs administered by both the Oregon Health Authority and the Oregon Department of Human Services, as well as changes to the tax code in which Oregon is directly connected to. Along with that $75 million deficit, state economists continue to raise concerns about potential recession risks and what that might mean. The first piece of the news that reduced that deficit was the passage of Senate bill, apologies here, I have a typo on this, it should be 1507. We'll have Senate bill 1507 is the federal disconnect bill that prevented the state rather from connecting to all provisions of the federal tax code. And the provisions that we disconnected from resulted in around a $311 million saving. In addition, the revenue forecast was dramatically up from the previous session, whereas they were forecasting a strong deficit. The deficit was much smaller. And the third factor that helped reduce the overall state deficit was the two agencies mentioned, OHA and ODHS, sharpened their pencils on what it means to implement the new requirements coming from HR 1. So both of those agencies had increased review requirements, increased eligibility requirements that do take staff time to review, but as they've gone through their programs, they've had a closer estimate for what that may mean, and it was a little bit lighter than what they forecasted when HR 1 first passed. And then another budget context happening parallel but distinct from the overall budget conversation was the ODOT budget deficit created by the referral of the 2025 transportation package. It was certainly a challenging moment for ODOT, and we'll talk more about what we came out with from ODOT's budget. But before we go to ODOT's budget, I want to highlight some of the general fund changes. So the next slide talks about the state's general fund. This is their most flexible funding source. And while this is not a comprehensive list, I just wanted to share some of the key summaries. A bit surprising for some of us was there increased investments coming from the legislature. I'll note new investments in universal representation, immigrant services, and refugee assistance, as well as increased resources for wildfire response. What's not on the slide is some resources to support deficits in fighting the 2025 wildfires. So additional resources to those agencies were also included in the budget package that was released on Sunday. And in addition to the increased investments, we also saw, as we expected, some reductions. Overall, there's quite a bit of agency reductions included in the package. Most of those reductions include holding positions vacant, eliminating vacant positions, and tightening services and supply budgets. There are also reductions related to decreases in specific revenue forecasts or revenue sources, which impact the percentage of allocations from those revenue sources directly to program as required by statute. And then the last reduction is one we're still digging into to understand. There's a few fund transfers from specific dedicated funds to the general fund that will occur in May of 2027. Don't quite have the detail yet of why those are happening in May, but certainly we'll share that as we learn more information. I think a thing to keep in mind here, that what I shared on the last slide, the overall amount that the legislature needed to reduce was around 130 million rather than the 275 million. And in addition, some of the reductions made by the legislature in the 2025 session have supported a more steady pace for the state budget this session, though this essentially, the state budget makers will tell you on day 6 after they wrote the budget, they had to begin working on this new budget. And luckily, we're not seeing dramatic cuts as were indicated by potential reductions with the overall larger figure, as well as reductions that were included in agency budgets or agency recommendations to the legislature. On top of the general fund changes, there were some changes in terms of bond funding. What you'll see on the slide here includes a mix of general obligation bonds, which are bonds against the state's general fund, and lottery bonds, which are bonds against lottery revenue. Lottery revenue is down, but as is typical, the state did hold back some bonding authority for both bonding types in the 25 session. So we saw increased bonding, particularly related to the Moda Center. If folks are following along closely with news in the Portland metro region, the Oregon Trailblazers were sold, and the new owner of the team has some concerns about the ability of the Moda Center to continue to serve the Oregon Trailblazers. The city of Portland has been working in close partnership with the governor's office and the legislature to secure funding to rehab that building. I'll note that is an important economic generator for the Portland metro region and for the entirety of the state. So there's some resources set aside to support the Moda Center renovations. In addition, we saw increased resources for housing production and affordable housing preservation, for public university projects, and a new state park coming soon. And then, as is typical, we saw a number of lottery fund investments in specific projects in district. I'll note that there were 14 city projects funded, as well as a recovery center in Clackamas County. There's more other projects funded as well. So I would encourage you all, if you're curious, to reach out and let us know. We can send over the documents that have additional information. And the last budget I wanted to walk through is the transportation budget. We've talked quite a bit at these calls about what ODOT is facing in terms of the $288 million deficit they face. Earlier this year, they shared 3 tiers of reductions if the legislature took no action. Those were very dramatic reductions that would have led to a 20% layoff for the ODOT workforce. Pardon me, the legislature determined not to take that reduction. So instead, they did take some agency reductions, around $80 million in positions held vacant, in services and supply changes, but there will be no layoffs of ODOT workers. In addition to no layoffs of ODOT workers, they are able to rehire some of the vacant positions, particularly for maintenance and DMV, that are causing some frustrations from the general public. As expected, the legislature did redirect ODOT funds to support operations and maintenance. The first 3 buckets you see there relate to ODOT operation funds, federal funds, and creating additional flexibility for the state highway funds that ODOT has. So those are all essentially repurposing existing ODOT funds to support operations. The next phase of reductions for ODOT is really just the cancellation of one project. There was additional passing lanes west of the city of Oak Ridge that was proposed in 2017. ODOT has reported there have been challenges with that project. As initially designed, it would not work, and they have some concerns about local support for that project. So that was pulled off of their books, and those $6 million is going to support general agency operations. Now, the last three bullets here are the final bucket of reductions for ODOT. And this is what we forecasted for a while that we expected to see. The legislature is diverting some funds that go to grant programs on a one-time basis to support the agency's operations. Legislative leadership have made it very clear their expectation is these are one-time diversion of funds for the first bullet, multimodal active transportation fund and student driver training. Those are complete pauses. My understanding is there's not additional resources left in those funds. However, for Connect Oregon and Safe Routes to School, there are some limited resources available. ODOT is working to determine which grant cycle will continue and which will be paused. It's likely they won't move forward with both of them. We're getting more information from ODOT now as they analyze the final budget that came through and work on materials to share out. So as soon as we have that, we'll share it out, and we'll certainly include more information in the agency, or excuse me, the LOC bill report. These are hard reductions. I do want to say that. And we're incredibly grateful that these are the reductions that the legislature took instead of touching the shared revenue and the shared funding sources we have that flow by formula to cities. So the legislature contemplated changes to the 50-30-20 split of the state highway fund. We're grateful that ultimately in the end that was not a real consideration in terms of how to fill ODOT's budget hole. And instead, unfortunately, the pain is being shared in many ways with ODOT operations and position reductions and cancellation of projects or pausing of projects, and in the grant programs that go to partners. That was a lot on budget. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, but want to pause in case there are any questions. All right, I'm not seeing any come through, so we'll switch and do transportation bill updates. There's really three main transportation bills that I know this group will care about. The first two have passed both chambers and are headed to the governor's desk. We've talked about them quite a bit. I won't go through them again. The last one was really the transportation bill that received most of the attention in this legislative session. Senate Bill 1599 moves the date of the transportation tax referendum from the November general election to the May primary. That passed both chambers and was signed by the governor on March 2nd. And then the same day, a lawsuit was filed to prohibit the Secretary of State from implementing the measure. So we're following that closely. Certainly does not change how we think about the resources available from the 2025 special session. We expected that measure, or rather we expect a vote to people to vote down the increased revenue. So what was included in the state shared revenue report that was finalized earlier this year includes assumptions as if the referendum passes. So want to make sure if you're working on your budgets, and if you are curious about which figures to use, the figures in the LOC shared revenue report are the correct figures to use. All right, I don't see any questions on transportation, so we're going to keep it moving. I mentioned the first bill on the next slide at the top of our presentation today. That is Senate Bill 1507. I'm waiting for the slides to catch up here. There we go. 1507 is the federal disconnect package. It is headed to the governor's desk. As we mentioned, this is also this is part of the budget balancing strategy. So it does include $311 million for it increases general fund by $311 million. Now, I don't want to steal the thunder of Scott, who is actively watching the floor right now. So we'll come back to talk more about the local act. Pretend you didn't see the spoiler on the screen. And we will skip the next few slides and wait for when Scott is back. And for now, we'll turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Nicole. Just took me a minute to get my video off there. Let's see, the single bill that I worked on this week, the rest of the bills on this bill had already met their fates. But recreational liability waivers have been a question in Oregon for about the last 11 years. Supreme Court decision related to the use of a waiver at a ski resort in Oregon deemed them to be quote unquote, or deemed that waiver in that situation to be quote unquote unconscionable. For the last 10 years, the rec industry, skiing industry in Oregon has suffered with the increased cost of insurance policies, if those policies are available. So this session, a concerted effort with organized groups of recreation industries came in to try to move a policy to fix the issue. That happened finally today. The bill 1517B was moved or was concurred upon in the Senate, completing its journey in the session. This is a very practical example of politics where you can come out happy not getting exactly what you wanted, but at the same time, progress was made on an issue that's very important to the state. So the bill effectively revalidates the use of a liability waiver in the state, creates a framework for that, but it does list 7 categories of exclusions in which those waivers won't apply. LOC will be working on a one-pager to help cities discern their process in going through their current liability waivers and how they want to address some of the exclusions. But we are happy and thankful to the legislative leadership that negotiated this bill at the 11th hour to get it passed. So, and thank you for the cities that weighed in on it. I know several of you submitted letters and agreed to testify. So, very happy that Senate Bill 1517B was able to pass today. Next slide. Yeah, all of these bills we've discussed in the past. So in the name of brevity, I will turn it over to the next person.
And that's me, the slide operator. Sorry for the slowness. I'm watching House or Senate floor on the side. They have the farm stand bill up right now, which I know we haven't talked about in this space, but I know a number of you are tracking. It seems like it's going to pass, so that's very exciting. We'll go through a lot of this relatively quickly. A lot of this is things that we've talked about before. We've expected things to pass. There's no surprises here. On 4037, I know we've got some mixed feelings from folks out there, especially about Section 17 and whether or not your city is okay with kind of that limit on public meeting or public hearings for individual housing applications. That one has passed both the House and the Senate. It was a little tied up. It was a little delayed. There was a little bit of a question as to whether or not it was going to pass. It has passed in the end. I will say, as it passed out of the Senate chamber, we did hear some comments about Goal 1 concerns. I think the legislature remains deeply tied on what they want to do about Goal 1. You have members of the legislature who very much don't know about Goal 1 in the modern era with NIMBYism, and you have legislators who really want to see Goal 1 continue to be a strong part of our land use system. This bill passed kind of, without that being much of a conversation on it. But we did see kind of finally the rumblings of they're going to have to come to an agreement about what they want to do about Goal 1 in the future. In happier news, both 4035, the kind of one-time UGB program expansion passed with kind of resounding support. We expect to see a webinar come out from DLCD in the coming weeks to give folks a better idea of exactly how to use that tool. Similarly with 4082, we expect those to kind of be wrapped together. And then the inclusionary housing program has passed. A little bit more interesting and timely, 1586, which was Senator Salmon's Jobs Act bill, did fail. She kind of, fell on the sword and killed her own bill to make a little bit of an easier path for 4084. In the end, it only contained the land use provisions and the research and development tax credit changes or creation and changes. We don't know if we will see that one come back next session. It's certainly been a controversial one, especially surrounding data centers, which is becoming an increasing flashpoint for our legislature. Which brings us to 4084. So 4084 passed more or less intact, with kind of one major change kind of at the 11th hour. And this is going to be a huge sticking point, and we're going to do some investigating on this one. At the 11th hour, there was a provision added to prohibit data centers from taking advantage of certain advantages of e-zones, things like that. for the next calendar year, or not the next calendar year, for the next year to allow the governor's data center working group to continue to meet and to come up with some advisements about what exactly um, the state would like, how they would like to address data centers in terms of our economic development, our land use, water and energy. Um, what I will flag there, no one is really sure how that section actually reads. There's a lot of confusion as to whether or not it applies to both standard enterprise zones and long-term enterprise zones, or if it just applies to standard enterprise zones. That's kind of the big question mark of the week. I know the Oregonian has reported that it doesn't apply to long-term. Others have reported that it does. It's really something that folks are continuing to crunch through. It's something that LOC will have a dive into and just kind of try to parse out exactly how that statute is written. It seems like the bill sponsor's intent was for it to apply to both, but that is a huge question mark, especially for those of you who are using the long-term enterprise zone provisions. That ends it for me, unless there are questions there. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and slide us back and turn it over to Scott, who hopefully has some fun news for us. I know it's not very fun, but.
Well, thanks, Alexandra. So I'm logging in from one of the phone booths off the Senate floor, and we're waiting to see the fate of House Bill 4177. This is the legislation that addresses the serial meetings issues. It's up on the calendar next. So hopefully we'll have some good news to share later this afternoon. On the tax and finance, we did get some great news yesterday. House Bill 4148. This is the bill that would allow cities to use 50% of their post-2003 imposed transient lodging tax for governmental services. Currently, that split is 70-30. 70% must go to tourism promotion, 30% can be used by the local government to meet the needs of their community. So that's going to bump to 50%. So this is a long time coming. Big win yesterday. It came off the floor. 22 aye votes, bipartisan support. Excellent. I want to give a tremendous amount of credit to Senator Weber for her leadership and her efforts on this, and she really went to bat for us on this one, as did other members. And so big thanks to the senator. So that is done, is on the way to the governor's desk. And we will there are some reporting requirements in there, so we're going to we'll do some training. We're going to talk internally at the league about how we help assist cities with those reporting requirements and what the reporting requirements will be on the travel organizations as well. The bill does allow for the issuance of resiliency grants to businesses. These are, the resiliency is not defined, so we're going to fall back in the bill. So we'll fall back on the Webster's definition of it, which is, you're trying a business that's overcoming a significant hurdle, a trauma. Then the local government could provide a direct grant to one of those businesses to assist them in rebounding. That part of the bill remains a little controversial, but we'll get some more guidance out to folks on that as well. So big long-term win for the league. Switching gears to the ethics package. So yesterday we have the 4161. This is the bill this is what we have called colloquially as the hot dog bill. This is the bill that ensures that food and beverages that are provided by the public agency a public official serves. We're talking OGEC. When we say public official, we of course mean not the elected officials, plus the employees, the volunteers, some of the contractors. They would be allowed to consume food provided by their agency, provided it's a meeting or an official event. And so largely a technical fix, but it did take some doing to get that through. Came out of both chambers. I believe it was unanimous. 4159 also passed the Senate yesterday. That has to go back to the House for concurrence. We're not really anticipating any challenges, but this does require that a member of the OGEC have some local government experience. We would we're looking to work with the appointing and the recommending or appointing entities on who that might be. So it would also fixes a loophole in or a technical issue with the executive session statute, and when the OGEC receives privileged information is part of an investigation on an executive session violation, that we wouldn't be waiving privilege, so that privileged information would remain that way. And then the big one, this is the one we're waiting on today, 4177, and this simplifies the serial meetings law passed in 2023, creates some very clear guidance on what is deliberation and, more importantly, what is not deliberation. It also will move administrative procedural violations to the public body and away from the public official. Right now, if somebody alleges a public notice was done wrong or they didn't like the minutes, it's the public official who has the complaint filed against them. Even though most city charters, the elected official isn't even allowed to participate in that process. So that's going to be, we're going to switch that around. This isn't everything we wanted in this process, but it's good. I think it's been quite the journey in the session, overcome some certain challenges with some folks who weren't too happy with some of this, and a lot of inertia and a lot of resistance from the OGEC staff. But I think we're in good shape. It will be on the floor in just a few minutes. We're hoping to have some good news, but they're talking a lot over there. So we'll send something out as soon as we know. So that is my update. I think I have time for a few questions on this before I go back in.
Thanks, Scott. We have one question, or rather just a comment that I'd love to read out loud and give you the chance to respond. It's coming from Mayor Wakalki from Lincoln City. It says, thanks to Senator Weber, I understand she convinced my senator to vote yes. This is TLT.
I am not privy to their internal conversations, but I think Senator Anderson, he not only did he vote yes, he had a minority report filed on this bill that he withdrew. So and thank you to you and to everybody on the coast who reached out to Senator Anderson.
Well, Scott, I'm not seeing any further questions for you. It looks like they're still on the farm stand bill, but I'm sure you're eager to get back, and we know OLIS is usually a couple minutes behind.
Yes, I would like to see this one through on the floor. So if you'll excuse me, we'll have more to say on all of this, I'm sure.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
All right. We'll go back to our regularly scheduled update. Alexander, if you'd advance the slides. And Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody. Michael Martin, one of the league lobbyists here. Have a brief update for you. I'm going to go slightly out of order here. So House Bill 4144, it's the battery producer responsibility. And just a little background on that. This basically would require producers of certain batteries and battery-containing products to join a battery producer responsibility organization. And the Department of Environmental Quality was directed to develop rules, as part of this process. I think with a lot of these things, given the conversation this session on the Recycling Modernization Act and this, at the end of the day, the cost of recycling does not go away for us. And so we'll be part of this conversation going forward. But this is looking at what other states have done, pros and cons of that, and going forward, we'll develop those rules during interim. And then second bill that I want to update you all on, which has just, like you've maybe picked up on the call, like there's active floor and Senate, House and Senate proceedings, is this bill, candidly, I mean, we thought was done. And at the 11th hour, this bill that would lower the grant match for 7 state programs for cities population 20,000 or fewer was scheduled for House rules this morning. We found out last night, and typically, we want to see it on the floor, but that's a strong indication that it will be going to the floor and passage. And it has just been an incredible amount of work. I know so many of you have done outreach, you've contacted your legislators, and a lot of people in the building have been a big part of this. And what started out as a conversation last session that, really big picture is, as cities, the state having a number of things that they mandate we do with limited resources. We think that this is a good opportunity to kind of start this broader conversation around infrastructure going forward and the cost of doing so, and how we can be partners with the state, and then extrapolating that out even to the federal government, how they can be partners in, making sure that you are all successful in what you do and plan for your communities. So really exciting, a lot of work, but this should be coming up on the House floor later this afternoon.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions come in for Michael, and I believe that is our last slide. Alexander, if you wouldn't mind just double checking. Yes, we usually end with assignments, but of course, on the dwindling hours of this legislative session, we have no further assignments for you. I want to echo what Michael said, and also applies to a lot of the work that Scott led on TLT this session. These bills are moving because of member engagement. You see, I'm looking through the list here and see a number of cities that gave us their logo, that submitted testimony, that testified live or in person, both on TLT and on the grants matching bill, including all named for grants matching cities that were not impacted by the bill, reached out to their legislators in support of the measure. So much appreciation to all of you for your work in ensuring we got our priorities through the legislative session. Of course, we've got 2 more that needs votes and another with a recurrence vote. So we're hoping that those all make it through, but we're feeling optimistic. And I think I speak for the entire lobby team at LOC that we're incredibly grateful for your engagement all throughout the session, and look forward to partnering with you in the future and in the next legislative session. I'm still not seeing any questions come through, so I have just a couple final updates for you. Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, or put them in the chat. One thing to make sure you're tracking, it was in the bulletin this morning. Policy committees have started. Those are available on LOC's website. They're public meetings, though even those that are not appointed by the board are welcome to attend, listen in to the conversation. And in addition, if you have a recommendation or a concept you'd like the policy committee to consider, please reach out to the point staff person for us to loop that idea into the process. In addition to the policy committees, I want to remind you what I said at the top of this meeting. Our last legislative update webinar will be next Friday, in which we summarize what passed, what happened with the legislative session. If you have any specific questions for that, you're welcome to ask them here, or reach out to any member of the lobby team over the course of the next week to make sure we address it next week. All right, I'm looking through for hands or questions, and I'm not seeing any. So just much appreciation to all of you for engaging, and don't be a stranger. Reach out to us if you've got any questions.